When David Cameron became British Prime Minister back in 2010, he spoke of a broken society, and he was determined to fix it.
People in troubled families aren't worthless, nor are they programmed to fail. I will not allow them to be written off. So let us get out there, help them turn their lives around, and heal the scars of a broken society.
The government created what it called a Troubled Families Programme, targeting money, a lot of money, at Britain's most challenged families, helping them, so it hoped, to become functional members of society. Good intentions, no doubt, but did it work? No, not according to recent independent evaluations, which have been blunt. The policy, they say, has achieved next to nothing. The government disputes that, of course, but the numbers don't look good. Policy failure isn't unusual. Governments everywhere, even trying to do the right thing, frequently get it wrong. Money is wasted, opportunities lost. Why? I'm Michael Blastland, and this is The Inquiry.
Part 1. The Charge Sheet.
I've been banging on this issue for 25 years.
Paul Light, Professor of Public Service at New York University, long-time critic of government failure, is our first expert and wears the scars of battle.
I worked on Capitol Hill. I've participated in drafting legislation that became law that I think contained the seeds of failure. So, I've been around.
We're not talking corruption here, we're talking failure. He collects examples in the US.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
The Shuttle Challenger accident, which was largely blamed on bureaucracy.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded.
We had the Iran-Contra scandal.
The president broke his pledge to the American people that he would not trade arms for hostages.
And then we had a major uptick under George W. Bush with the Iraq War.
The only possible explanation, the only possible use he could have for those weapons is to dominate, intimidate, or attack.
And a number of other failures, from a shortage of flu vaccine to major problems with many federal programs. And under Obama, those breakdowns have increased ever so slightly.
It's not just a public perception, he argues, that things are getting worse.
We've had more visible stories of failure, and I would argue that we have had more failure itself. I don't blame the media for this.
Elsewhere, some might list European Monetary Union as a big policy facing a rough ride. And you might want to add as a failure the claims of stable economic management that went down with the 2008 global financial crash. Oh, there's success too. It's just that so much fails to live up to expectations.
We promise too much. That's a fundamental policy failure.
Promises, the language of politics. And one reason for disappointment. Another, he says, is lack of will at the top for the mundane task of effective administration.
Presidents don't really have the energy to do it. It's kind of boring. You want to make a promise like we can deliver health care and we can do it quickly. You don't want to say, listen, our bureaucracy doesn't work really well. We'll get back to you on the implementation date. And the legislation isn't really that easy to implement. We'll get back to you on that.
Every presidential candidate, he says, talks the talk.
If we're to change America, we must change the way government works.
As your president, I'll fight to make government work better for you, your families.
We're holding ourselves accountable, and we're deeply committed and focused on making government function better.
We need to make government work for you.
Few make it a priority once in office. If you sense a certain weariness in Paul Light, you're right. Discussing this is almost like therapy, he joked. I can't detect a great deal of optimism here.
Well, I am a little bit worn out with this fighting for better delivery, better execution. I'm often reminded of the ancient Japanese proverb that action without execution is but an act of daydreaming. I'll give you one little fact. The vast majority of Americans believe that ordinary citizens could do a better job solving our problems than their elected officials.
Ouch. A long charge sheet, declining faith that government is even competent. But perhaps, says our next witness, that says as much about us as them.
Part 2. How hard can it be?
Fancy talking to you in a radio studio?
Well, I just don't know what's going on, yes.
Nick Chater, Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School and my co-presenter on another BBC programme. I put to him the claim that the US public thinks ordinary citizens could do a better job of government.
Right, yes, that's interesting and a bit scary.
Scary? Because of what it says not about government, but about us.
This is like the Football Manager, isn't it? Everybody thinks they can manage Manchester United better than the actual manager.
If it is like the Football Manager, being second-guessed is an occupational hazard.
The defence is absolutely diabolical.
He put out, I won't say half a strength team, I put a three-quarter strength team out. I just question why he did that.
We should have got a defensive midfielder in the summer.
I mean, what is he doing?
I think we're all very bad at evaluating how good we'd be at all sorts of tasks.
It's a psychological quirk sometimes known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, named after the academics who studied it, and can apply both to voters and budding politicians.
If you are fairly clueless about what's involved in, for example, governing a country, then one can imagine governing it and making decisions and people rushing about doing your bidding and everything working out wonderfully without any idea of the complexity of the problem and how disastrously you'll be doing.
If easy is what it looks like, and easy is what politicians often imply, what explains the mismatch between this self-belief and failure?
There's lots of complexity out there which we're not actually observing. But because we're not observing it, we tend to discount it completely. It's a classic mistake looking at the autopsies of military disasters. The commander simply does not conceive of a possibility, does not cross their mind that the troops of the enemy might be somewhere else than they expect. And I think that's a very general problem. The world is complicated, we only see a bit of it.
Ignorance, says Nick Chater, can breed overconfidence. Have you ever caught yourself guilty of Dunning-Kruger?
I'm sure we all have, yes.
Can you think of any examples?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've got a perfect example, yes. I once went on a boating holiday in France on the canals with a very large and rather heavy, I think 16-ton boat. And in the brochure, it said, this is quite a difficult boat to steer and it'll take a while to get the hang of it. To which I thought, well, I mean, how hard can it be? It's only going at about 3 miles an hour and it's an enormous great thing. It can only move very slowly. And indeed, I spent a great part of the holiday zooming around in all directions and rotating and going from side to side. It was absolutely horrendous and indeed hitting the side of the boat, hitting bridges.
How hard can it be? We've all said it. Does that criticism of government turn out, like Nick's boat trip, to contribute to the very failure it complains of?
Well, I think one thing that it does do, which is quite important, is that it diminishes one's respect for expertise and experience. So to the extent that one feels, I could do a pretty good job at that, it's not that hard, then one trusts one's own judgment as much as one would trust somebody who's had sort of 30 years experience in Parliament or is a respected political scientist or economist.
You, me, the governor of the central bank, the chief scientific advisor, what's the difference? Does this belief make for bad government?
I think it can do, because I think it means that the restraints on government from the population may not be as sharp as they should be. So where it is the case that there will be incisive criticism of certain government actions which would come from experts, then there's a danger that that is diluted because people think, well, the experts supposedly don't know any more than I do.
There is a remedy implied here. Put faith in genuine expertise rather than the self-deluded kind. Not always a fashionable cause, experts, especially if they deliberate beyond the gaze of voters.
So, to base our decision making on evidence, on complicated issues of medical policy, healthcare, criminal justice, and so on, we need to be able to synthesize the evidence and analysis that's been done by thousands of researchers around the world into a coherent form and take this as our basis for action. But of course, that's a process that can only go on in some rarefied world of universities and think tanks and research organizations. It can't effectively go on in the public sphere because the issues are very technical and specialized. And I think that does create a problem.
It's not that Nick Chater wants a pure technocracy, government by experts. He'd insist on strong democratic oversight. But he is a fan of central bank independence, for example, where experts decide the interest rate free of political interference.
The problem of making good political decisions is unimaginably difficult. The world is enormously complicated. It does not help if we imagine that we're actually playing noughts and crosses when we're actually stuck in a game of three-dimensional chess.
Ah, for government based on sound understanding that knows complexity when it sees it, and using, of course, the best evidence of what actually works. Which brings us to our next expert witness.
Part 3. Evidence of what?
I grew up in a Manhattan Project town, which is one of the communities created in the 40s to do work on the atomic bomb.
Sharon Witherspoon has been a social scientist all her working life. Now head of policy at the Academy for Social Sciences in the UK, she says that childhood in the shadow of the bomb made her aware that what seems normal can be anything but.
I mean, I remember the evening siren used to go off, and it was the air raid siren, the bombers are coming siren in the 60s, 70s. And I always thought it was just a signal the mothers got to tell you it was time to come in off the streets and, get home. And it was only stepping back you realize this was a taken for granted element. So I think part of what drives social science is realizing that lots of the common sense things we take for granted aren't quite as true as we all like to think.
The implication for grown-ups is that we have to look beyond our assumptions and examine the hard evidence.
Governments have always used evidence and traditionally used civil servants to accumulate and compile and synthesize evidence. But you saw moves during the 80s, but particularly in the 90s, to do that more comprehensively, to brand these under the umbrella of evidence-based policy.
Just what Nick Chater ordered. An example is the kite mark symbol for education in the US, she says, to show that there's good evidence an idea does work. But has evidence-based policy improved government? Sharon Witherspoon's answer is, eventually, sometimes, maybe. Take Sure Start, an educational programme for very young children from poorer backgrounds, launched by Britain's then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown.
A Sure Start for all Britain's children is not only right, but it is the best anti-crime, the best anti-drugs, the best anti-unemployment, the best anti-dependency policy for this country's future.
Parents were given a say in how it was done to help persuade them to take part, coupled with the best evidence for good teaching. What happened? Well,
the community choice model sometimes cut against the evidence on what works.
You mean people didn't want what the evidence suggested?
Well,
they had other priorities, maybe?
More that there were a lot of interventions that were popular with parents, but not a lot of good evidence that they dramatically improved outcomes for children.
The lesson: learn how things can fail and put them right before you roll them out nationwide.
It would have saved a lot of money, and it would have been better for children had they got it more right in the first place.
Another problem with evidence is its limitations. Even when you have it, you can't always translate it into action.
What I think is underappreciated is that information alone is rarely the answer to get people to behave according to the evidence.
So you tell them what works, but that's not enough.
It's not enough, and that's because behavior is complicated. And it's very clear from really strong examples that even presenting skilled professionals with the evidence is rarely enough on its own to bring about thoroughgoing behaviour change.
Well, I'm curious why it doesn't work.
Partly because we are social creatures. We have a lot of things we're doing in social behaviour. We have emotional needs. We're not just rational actors.
As a government, sure, you can tell me how much I should drink. But don't be surprised that you fail to change my behaviour if round where I work the custom is 6 pints after hours and I want to fit in. Sharon Witherspoon thinks the use of evidence has improved a bit, and I'd agree. But if she could make one suggestion, it would be to pilot policies. Try them out.
I try to draft some rules about piloting. I accept you can't do that for every policy. But for instance, before you dramatically change certain benefits, you need not just a pilot of a couple of hundred people lasting a couple of weeks. You actually need to say, we're going to see if this does work.
So you're advocating experiment?
Yes, I am.
Do you think the public would stand for that if you say, hang on, we don't know what to do, we're going to spend 5 years working it out?
I think in some areas they wouldn't, but I think in lots of areas people are also uncomfortable by the pendulum changes. 1 5-year period we're doing X and the next 5-year period we're doing something different. So I think we're often not very good at just explaining, we think this will work, it's worth a trial, but before we spend billions of pounds, we think a trial of a couple of years in areas that allow us to say, does this work, would be helpful.
But you have to start from a position which sounds to me a bit like humility.
Yes, I think humility, and I think a little bit of skepticism that things are rarely as simple as we'd like to believe.
Why do governments do stupid things? Our 3 witnesses so far have an intimidating list. 1, they can't be bothered with the boring stuff. 2, we encourage them with ignorant expectations. They encourage us with easy policies. 3, even good evidence is harder than it looks. How do those who do the job answer? Our final expert witness.
Part 4. Thanks for the advice.
David Willett, will my honourable friend agree that our higher education reforms have delivered more students, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, more funding for teaching in universities than ever before?
David Willetts worked as an official in the British Treasury, on Margaret Thatcher's staff in Downing Street, a Conservative MP for over 20 years, was Minister for Universities and Science, and is now Executive Chair of the Resolution Foundation, a think tank, and a member of the House of Lords. Government? Been there, done it.
I do think there are big challenges facing countries which governments find it hard to tackle. You don't elect governments to do the easy things, you elect them to do the harder things that other people haven't been able to do.
A good example of one of those hard problems is social mobility.
The government's come up with more and more innovative policies trying to provide better opportunities for people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. And meanwhile, parents, and I completely understand and sympathise, it's an admirable human motive, want to do the best for their kids and invest in more and more things for their kids to try to ensure they'll still come out on top. This is a very good example of a policy dilemma. Governments are trying to do the right thing, parents are trying to do the right thing by their kids, and we all end up with, sadly, not massive progress on social mobility.
So the first defence is that in a changing world, we, the people, can frustrate our own government's best intentions for us. What's more,
the evidence itself is not straightforward. You think the evidence proves X, and then someone goes off and does another piece of research and suggests that X isn't the case after all.
And you can't just wait, he says, for arguments about the evidence to stop. He cites the case of vocational qualifications, said by one study to be not much use, but highly rated by another a few years later. Evidence might shift, he says. A political party needs consistency.
If the manifesto just said, well, we will find out the evidence about what works and act accordingly, it would give people no basis on which to judge or predict what people will do, because values matter, beliefs matter. And so, although you have to be sensitive to overwhelming evidence and shifts in tides of views about what matters or what doesn't, You can't be hypersensitive. You'll just start jumping around and nobody will know where you stand on anything.
Well, you could be firm in your objectives, but open-minded about the means. Try a few things out. But to the call for more experiment, David Willetts gives only partial agreement.
You can't always just say, we're going to run a sort of randomised control trial. You just do sometimes need to get on with things, and it's better to get on with something than depriving people of something you believe to be worthwhile.
I guess you can't trial Brexit either, or monetary union, or a host of other things. They're one-offs.
Exactly.
People in government don't set out to make mistakes. No one says, let's start a futile war that'll do more harm than good. Let's wreck the economy. The puzzle to me is that we've learnt much about why we make mistakes. About, for example, the psychological biases that cause us to think we know more than we do. The tendency to seek evidence that confirms what we think we already know. To see the world partially. We know this now. But perhaps we just like being that way.
I mean, mistakes can take... Look, I've been involved in quite a few over the years. I know mistakes can take many forms. One form that they can take is when, in the tribal grouping of a political party, you're surrounded with people with a broadly similar political beliefs to yourselves that you hopefully trust. Can also be a closed group where you are endlessly reinforcing each other, uncomfortable evidence about something not working isn't being cited. And so the very factors that you need in order to be an organised political party can sometimes get in the way.
Does party politics trump everything? And does it therefore bear a chunk of the blame? If so, we should at least recognise that good government is not the only thing politics hopes to deliver. Perhaps not even the main thing. It also exists as a theatre for our differences, to stop us cutting each other's throats. The policy outcome matters, for sure, and could certainly be better. But so does the process of getting there, democracy, in which governments sometimes do stupid things, because democracy aspires to include everyone. Partial viewpoints, groupthink, psychological biases, ignorance and all, in them and us. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Michael Blastland, and produced in London by Estelle Doyle and Sarah Shabir. You can find and download all our programmes online. I recommend What's the Story of Aleppo? And you can get in touch by leaving a message on the World Service Facebook page or find us on Twitter. We're at BBC The Inquiry.